Hi.
Hi,
So thank you for being here. Could you introduce yourself and share what you do?
I'm Larry Hama, and I've been a writer, penciler, inker, colorist, editor in the comic book business for about 50 years. I've taken forays into acting and illustration and other things, played in a band for 20 something years, but I basically still consider myself a cartoonist at heart. I was born in Flower Hospital on Fifth Avenue, which is no longer there in Manhattan. It was on Fifth Avenue up near Harlem, near Spanish Harlem. My family moved to Queens before I was in kindergarten. So I went to school in Queens in an area called Floral Park, which at that time was sort of very working class, Irish, Italian, Jewish. At the time, there was only one other Asian family in the neighborhood. And these kids they were Japanese American. There were three of them, two girls and a boy. They all went to that same school before I did. It was horrible. Not only were they like the smartest kids in the school, but they were incredibly good looking. And they were incredibly popular. The father was a lawyer, a maritime lawyer, and the mother was a homemaker. They were like father knows best. Whatever teacher I had all three of them before, one after the other. It was an impossible goalpost. I was expected to be like them because in this case, these were the only Asians that these teachers had ever been in contact with. And they had these kids one after the other. It was horrific. At the same time, for most of my school days in Queens, I would be the only Asian in the entire school. Oddly, I never ran into very much hate or pressure or, prejudice. It was a different time.
How did your parents end up in New York?
My mother was in Tule Lake. There were the two sisters and their parents. My grandfather was an officer in the Okayama Kenjinkai, which is like a family association. People from Okayama Prefecture. It wasn't a political organization. It was like a social club. They had picnics and potlucks, and it was basically set up for people from that prefecture to help each other, almost exactly like a family association. Only it was a prefecture association. But because he was an officer in an organization like that, he was considered possibly a dangerous alien. So he was sent to Tule Lake, which was a camp for people who they thought was at a higher level of security risk. My mom and her sisters didn't want them. He was elderly at the time. My grandmother was close to 50 when my youngest aunt was born. They opted to voluntarily go to Tule Lake along with my grandparents, but they didn't want to be separated. And after the war, they all relocated to Cleveland. And then my mom ended up in New York because she wanted to go to FIT and learn pattern making. She was a dressmaker. My mom was a Nisei. She was born in Sacramento, California, along with two of her sisters. The eldest sister, the Date sisters, never left Japan because my grandfather came over, and it was something like 14 years before he was able to get enough money to bring my grandmother over. And by that time, they had already had a daughter in Japan. She was like 15 years old. In those days it was marriage age. So she didn't want to leave. She stayed behind and never came to the States. So they started a whole new family here in the States. Had a son who died in the 1918 flu epidemic and three daughters. My dad apparently jumped ship in Seattle, I think in the 20s, and was in Chicago where he had a restaurant, and then he had some sort of nightclub. And he was married to a woman from Tennessee, Scotch-Irish descent, and had two kids before they split up, and he moved to New York where he met my mom.
What kind of work did your dad do?
My dad was a watchmaker, a jeweler, and an optician.
Wow.
And he had a little jewelry shop and a watch repair shop in the Bronx.
Did you have siblings?
I was an only child. I have two half brothers named Hama, who grew up in rural Tennessee during the war, which must have been really rough. I'm in contact with them. They sort of found me through the internet about 20 years ago. I got a call. And this guy said, "Was your father Paul or Taro Hama?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, you're my brother."
Wow.
Let's get together and meet. I had known that they existed, but I had no idea how to contact. It didn't never occur to me that they would have a name.
Is it nice to be in contact?
Oh yeah, it's terrific. It's amazing that we share so many traits. We all play guitar. They just didn't play guitar. They were really good. And their mother played the mandolin. And apparently they had a musical trio of two guitars and a mandolin. And they played country western music, and they performed at county fairs all over rural Tennessee.
Are they still in Tennessee now?
No, no. My brother lived in Benicia, California, which is just outside of San Francisco. Now he's retired in Utah.
Can you talk a little bit about what it was like in school being the only Asian American student? What were your friendships like? And what were you interested in?
I was interested in drawing. I had plenty of friends growing up in the neighborhood. They were Irish, Italian, and Jewish. I never felt like the other because I wasn't treated like that. One thing I realized many years later, your ability at language has a lot to do with your acceptance. I think it's basic human instinct. If you sound like you're one of us, you are one of us. That sort of came home to me when I was in the service. There was this Chinese guy I knew who was from Dallas, Texas, born and raised and grew up in Dallas. Had this really thick Texas accent. And even though he was Chinese, his natural nickname was Tex. When I read about the Chinese kid in the Gulf War who shot himself because he was harassed, the thing was that he had this really thick accent. So I think the language thing has a lot to do with it. And I'm fairly good at picking up dialect. It's a natural survival instinct that you speak like whoever you're amidst. It took me a long time to not speak like I was from that section of Queens. My original dialect was closer to Sylvester Stallone. My best friend's sister's name was Antoinette. It was not pronounced Antoinette in that neighborhood. It was pronounced Antoinette. I had to really train myself to speak in an unaccented New York dialect. The thing, though, about being able to speak in that native dialect makes you more acceptable. I went to high school, a high school of art and design in Manhattan, specialized high school, and there was a kid named David Chun, who was Chinese, but he grew up in Jamaica, Queens, in a completely Black environment. He dressed in that style and he spoke like, he was like from the deep ghetto. He played bass in a funk band. He had this little pancake hat and a sheepskin jacket, what's it called? It was like mohair, whatever. And all of his friends at school were Black. About 20 years ago, I went to a high school reunion and he didn't show up. I was talking to a half a dozen of my Black friends from the school, and they were talking about David. Oh man, that David, whatever happened to David, And one of them said, you remember David, that Chinese guy? And one of the guys, Wendell, turned and he said, wait a minute, he wasn't a brother? That's the power of language and tribal acceptance.
So how was that for you in terms of understanding yourself as Asian American?
It taught me early that you're much safer blending in than you are sticking out. Later on, I sort of reversed that. I'm better off sticking out, but that's a harder route to take.
How did you end up going to the arts high school?
In junior high school, I was still in Queens. I had an art teacher named Ann Leibowitz, who was really incredible. She took an interest in me because I could draw, and she encouraged me to take the test for the High School of Art and Design. I'd never heard of it. She got me all the information and set it up, and I went and took the test, and I got accepted. That really changed my life because here was a school where everybody was interested in the same thing. It was incredibly diverse. A lot of Asian, Blacks, Latinos from all 5 boroughs. So I was exposed to different diverse types of people that had no access to my little patch of Queens. It was where I actually started to meet Chinese kids, and a few of them became, lifelong friends.
How did your parents feel about you going to an art school?
My dad had died when I was in the 2nd grade, so it was just my mom. She was fine with my going to an art school. But I was very interested in drawing, even in 6th grade. It was clear that I wanted to do something in that line. She insisted that I take music lessons. And I said, well, I don't want to play an instrument. She said, no, you have to know how to play an instrument. I said, well, why? She said, what if you go blind? Mom, I never even thought about that. Now I'm going to stay up all night, worrying about, going blind.
I mean, it's solid logic from a mother's point of view.
Oh, yeah. Very solid logic. I remember when I got my first monthly comic book to do at Marvel. I called up my mom. I said, Mom, I got a Marvel, and I'm doing a monthly Marvel comic. And she said, that's nice. When are you going to get a real job?
She must not have been familiar with the comic book.
No, she knew nothing about the comic book world, except that I had big piles of them in my closet. In the 50s, every kid had comics, even the girls. All my girl cousins, the girls that I knew, all had stacks of comics. They had different comics than the boys had. I mean, they had Archie comics and Little Lulus and Harvey comics and romance comics and Lois Lane comics. Whenever I would visit like my cousins, I would read all their comics. And whenever they came to our place, my girl cousins would read my comics. That's when I realized that if reading material comes into a family and there's a number of siblings, pretty much all the siblings read all that material. That's the thing about published works. In magazine publishing, there's a thing known as the pass-along ratio. Certain types of publications have high pass-along ratios, which means that for every book that they sell, upwards of 5 to 10 sets of eyes see those things. And there's lots of magazines with only a single reader. Comic books had an extremely high pass-along ratio. I think the highest ones were things like Reader's Digest and National Geographic, any magazine that you would find in a dentist office. The pass-along ratio directly affected the ad page rate. The higher pass-along ratio you had, the more you could charge for ads. When I was a kid, I used to get my hair cut at a barbershop in Queens. And this is in the 50s. And they had comic books sitting there. They were covered with hair, little hairs that were from World War II. These Black Hawk comics that were sitting there, and I read them. I read every single comic they had in the barbershop over the course of years. And one day I realized how many kids had read
Mm,
these comics. That's what I really started to realize what the impact of certain things is. The
yeah.
actual number of people it reaches is far greater than the actual sales figures.
When you were in high school and you
Uh,
were studying art, were you already interested in drawing comics?
well, actually, when I was a little kid, I wanted to be a fashion designer. The first job I had out of high school, I was drawing shoes for Sears Oprah catalogs. My mom was in the fashion business. I thought, "Wow, this is really cool." And I liked ladies. My very first day at the High School of Art and Design, I'm sitting there in the cafeteria. I don't know a single soul. This tall black kid walks up to me, total stranger. He says, "Hey, do you like comics?" And I said, "No." That did not deter him. He was positive and cheerful. "I really like comics," and blah blah blah. And he just started talking and talking. He said, I know real cartoonists. I'm going to go visit this cartoonist I know after school today. You want to come along with me?" And somehow I just said, "Okay." It's just like one of those things where like one weird decision is the fork in the road of your entire life.
Yeah.
And I went with this guy. His name was John Smith. So I
Okay.
go with John Smith and we go to Larry Ivy's house. Larry Ivy was a comic book fan and a cartoonist who was editing a magazine called Castle of Frankenstein. It's a monster magazine. And he wrote for fanzines and he knew a lot of cartoonists. And he had this great collection of stuff. That was there when I first got exposed to all the great comics from the EC era and the newspaper strips like the Prince Valiant and all that. And through Larry Ivy, I met Wally Wood and Al Williamson, a lot of these other seminal comic book artists from that era. That's where it all sort of began. And oddly, and JD never went into comics. His name was John Darrell Smith. So now he goes by JD Smith.
What
And
did he end up doing?
he's a very famous custom knife maker in Boston. He has his own forge and he makes art knives and swords.
Wow.
They're art pieces. They're not stuff you go camping with. And he taught for a while at, I think, BU. He taught metallurgy. We're still good friends to this day. In fact, I'm still in touch with at least 4 or 5 people I went to kindergarten with.
How do you think that happened, being able to stay in touch like that?
I don't know. I'm always surprised when other people tell me like they know nobody from grammar school. I find that hard to comprehend.
Why did John Smith know Larry Ivy?
I have no idea.
He was a student.
He was a student, but he was very adventurous and very brave. Like one day he would say, like, "Oh, let's go visit Mad Magazine." I go, "What? You can do that?" So we went over there, and and he sort of knew the receptionist. He'd say, "Oh, can we just come in and like look at all the stuff on the walls?" And they had all the cover paintings from Mad Magazine back to the beginning hanging on the walls, and we just stare at them. And artists would come in and talk to us, and it was great. John Smith had no fear. Then he'd say, "Oh, let's go visit Help Magazine." Help Magazine was something that Harvey Kurtzman had published after he founded Mad Magazine and went off on his own. They had one little tiny room as their office. It was a humor magazine. The art director was Terry Gilliam, who later went on to be
Yeah.
the cartoonist guy in Monty Python. And the receptionist was Gloria Steinem.
At Health Magazine.
This was one of her first jobs in publishing. Apparently, her father knew Harvey Kurtzman, and her job was to convince celebrities to be on the covers for free.
Do you think that John Smith had some kind of access that maybe you didn't know about?
No, no, he would just like show up, and he was very charming.
So this fork in the road happened and you were exposed to this whole other world. Were you then drawn to that world?
I
Did
was
it?
drawn to that world in an odd way. I got an after-school job through Larry Ivy at Castle of Frankenstein. Through that, I met Bob Stewart, who was the art director at Castle of Frankenstein. He introduced me to all the underground cartoonists in New York. They were just starting up at that time. It was through him that I met Von Bodie and Trina Robbins and Kim Deitch and all these other people. And they included me in a publication called Gothic Blimp Works, which was the Sunday funnies of East Village Other. The artists in Gothic Blimp Works included R. Crumb, Trina, Kim Deitch, Skip Williamson, Spain Rodriguez, Von Bodie himself, Art Spiegelman, and guys who later broke into mainstream comics like Michael Kaluta and Bernie Wrightson.
Wow.
We all got our start on Gothic Blimp Works. And about a year later, there was a show at the Corcoran Gallery of Modern Art in Washington, D.C. on DuPont Circle called the Fonus Baronis, which was a show of work from Gothic Blimp Works. So I was included in that show also. It was the first legitimate gallery showing of underground comic art in the world.
Wow. Do you have any documentation of that show?
I have the catalog someplace.
Yeah.
I've just boxes and boxes of stuff that I've moved, so I haven't really unpacked a lot of stuff.
Before we go, can you break down the difference between an editor, an illustrator, and a writer within the comic book field?
The jobs sort of change. A lot of these separate jobs were created after the fact. Obviously, when the industry started, people did their own stuff. They penciled it, inked it, lettered it, colored it all themselves, or they had their own studios. They did all that. But when comics had to go on monthly schedules, it was wiser to break up the jobs. So somebody was really good at visual storytelling. Okay, let him just pencil. Somebody was good at embellishment. He's an inker. So we get twice as much product out using the same people. So there were pencilers, inkers, letterers, and colorists. That's all fairly self-descriptive. An editor in comics is 80% traffic managing. I was an editor for almost 20 years. My job was to make sure a writer got the assignment, made sure that he had it in on time, and then I passed the plot on to the artist and made sure that he passes the pages back. It's keeping track of where all these pages are as they circulate from each person in the chain. So it goes from the penciler to the letterer, and then to the inker, and then to the colorist, and then back to me.
What's the difference between the inker and the colorist?
Well, in those days, it was 3-color process. The inker did the black lines, and then they would shoot the inked page. You couldn't shoot from the pencil. You'd have a black and white image of it.
Yeah.
So that they would pass along a Xerox of the black and white page to the colorist, and the colorist would only be doing a colored guide time. And they had a set of Dr. Martin's aniline dyes that were pre-mixed to match up to the coloring methodology. So you had 3 colors and black at the printers. You had red, yellow, and blue, and all the colors were combinations of those in percentages. So you only had a choice between 100%, 25%, and 50% of each color. 25% yellow would be marked as Y2, and 25% red is R2. So like Caucasian flesh tone in comic book coloring code was Y2, R2. I always suspected R2D2 came from. So the colorists would use the dyes to indicate the color, and then to make sure it was clear, they would mark it with a color code, Y2, R2, R2 just pink. Then these indicators were sent every week. There was a guy named Chemical Eddie who worked for the chemical separation plant in Connecticut, Derby, Connecticut. He had this beat up old station wagon. He would go to every comic book company in Manhattan and collect all the color guides. Chemical Eddie would take them up where they had this big room full of ladies with blue hair, blue rinse, older women with blue hair, and they would actually do the physical color separations on acetates. And they had these pots of this red gunk and these thick brushes, and they would make each plate. And they had thick brushes, so you couldn't really do fine stuff. That's what went to the printing plant. Those hand color separation in those days. It's all done in Photoshop now. This is all the stuff I'm talking about is totally obsolete. All of that would be then sent to Sparta, Illinois. Every magazine in the country was printed in Sparta, Illinois. It was a city that had nothing but printing presses. Sparta was in the middle of the country, and all these printed things had to move by truck. So it made more sense to have a central location that all started from. Your longest truck route would be 1,500 miles instead of 3,000.
What is the industry there now?
Nothing. It's a ghost town. It's the Rust Belt. They never kept up their infrastructure. They just used those presses until they all wore out. Nobody in this country wanted to work on the infrastructure. Whereas in Germany and Japan, both been bombed into the Stone Age, they had to like create new factories for everything. Everybody else's technology was way ahead of ours. All the presses in Sparta went moribund, and all the work went to Montreal and Quebec, where most of our stuff is now printed, Montreal or Korea.
Which was your favorite role?
I always considered myself the guy that drew this stuff. It took me years and years to be able to convince anybody in the comic book industry to let me write anything. Their attitude was, "Oh, you're an artist, you can't write." Also, all the editors were writers, and artists writing their own stuff was like taking money out of their pockets. All my friends are artists in the business. I'm not all that friendly with very many writers because I never really considered myself a writer, sort of a penciler with a word processor. I try to avoid using the word artist. I don't think it's a job description. It's an appellation. I think calling yourself an artist is akin to calling yourself a poet. You have to be acclaimed. It's the people have to say, "Oh, he's a poet." Art, that's an acclamation. Everything is not art. Just
Right.
because you made it, it's not art. In my mind, calling yourself an artist is like the height of hubris.
What do you call yourself then?
I call myself a penciler
Do you feel like
or a cartoonist.
do you feel like the writer role in the comic book world always drives the story?
Not necessarily. Comics is a visual medium. The problem is there's a lot of writers in comics who are not visually oriented. That's why you get comics about people sitting in a room talking for 10 pages. When I was an editor, I would tell my writers, look, like, we're not writing radio drama. Write pictures, write action. 90% of the story should be totally understandable without having to read a single word. Somebody who doesn't even understand English should be able to pick up one of your books and tell mostly what's going on. There was a Japanese manga called Lone Wolf and Cub. It was called the Baby Cart series. The samurai with this little kid in a baby cart, running around being an assassin. He had the sign that said assassin or child. Ogami Ito was the name. When it first published in the 70s, I found some copies at the Zen bookstore in Manhattan, Rockefeller Center, and I bought them up. I bought up every one they had. I had them in a shopping bag at my office, the studio. And when other artists would come in, I'd sell them to them for cover price, what I paid for. And they were in Japanese, but you could understand the visual storytelling was so clear and the acting was so vivid that we could understand these stories. And I remember my friend Mike Kaluta, who can't understand Japanese either, he had the whole set like I did at dinner. We were talking, and we started talking about the stories. Oh, remember when Daigoro was like left alone in the baby cart and he had to fend for himself all day and blah, 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 blah. After about 5 minutes, we realized, we've been talking about all these stories and we had no idea what they're saying. That's the power of that visual storytelling. It can transcend that language. That's the power of some of our best visual comics.
Would you recommend anything of yours that I should read before we talk again?
Well, I just did an Iron Fist 6-part miniseries that I'm pretty proud of. It's called Iron Fist: Heart of the Dragon. There's already a compilation of it. It came out last year.
I'll do that. I'll pick it up. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Bye.
Bye.